It's a Dungeons & Dragons podcast that'll really make you think. We're spicing up the rules, mashing up the homebrews, and stirring up the debates. Add a little touch of our own, and you have Chef Bolg and the Pirate Captain's recipes for everything. With your host, the Pirate Captain.
It's not because I took on an entire ship by myself and walked away unscathed just off good looks alone.
Chef Bolg.
I have in my rules for the original AG, don't be a dick.
And Loke the Bard.
Lock the Bard bans all bards from his campaign. That wouldn't go over very well.
And without further ado, here are your hosts.
Well, that be right. We're back for another great episode. It is I, the Pirate Captain, along with me bestest buddies, Chef Bolg.
Hi, everybody.
And Loke the Bard.
Hey, how's it going, everyone?
All right, we've got a great episode coming up for you. This is one we have been teasing for the last couple months since Loke the Bard reached out, got this interview for us, and we're going to get to him here in a second. I just want to make sure I'm plugging out all the right stuff because we got a lot coming up. We got the Facebook page that you guys should all be going out to check out. It's Chef Bolg and the Pirate Captain. If you Google that on Facebook, it's the first thing that actually pulls up. We have our email. Make sure you email us, bolgandpc@gmail.com. That's one of the best ways to get in touch with us. We all read the emails. We've all been going back and forth with those, so we are excited to have you guys. And then one more thing, Phoenix Emporium. Obviously, we had Shane in here last week, and he is the co-owner of Phoenix Emporium, and they have a big D&D event coming up on the 19th, and I'm not going to tell you who, but there's going to be a couple of us that are going to be there. Come by, hang out with us, get to meet us. We know a lot of listeners are actually coming from Phoenix Emporium now because of Shane. It did so well, but that's I want to make sure that we get that out. Well, now it's time to the big event. This is, like I said, I've been teasing this thing for the last month. I've been excited about this guest. He is a awesome writer. I've read, I haven't read any of his actual books that I want to talk about, but I've read the paper, which is sparking this conversation. It's a hot topic right now, but I want to let him talk about it too. This is Professor Chris Ferguson of Stetson University. He is a very well-renowned, I would say he's pretty well-renowned within the country because he has work that's been cited by the Supreme Court. He's done research on media, from video games to social media to 13 Reasons Why. In fact, he's a psychology professor here at Stetson University. I want to make sure we get that out. And he has done something that did a recent research topic on it that kind of falls into what we are talking about right now. And it's kind of on, are Orcs racist? And we're going to get into our own personal beliefs in that. We're going to talk about that. But I want to introduce to you Professor Chris Ferguson. How you doing?
Hey, guys. Yeah, I'm doing really good today. Thanks for having me on.
No, we appreciate you coming on with us, man. It's
Absolutely.
This is a pretty big one. You're like our first major guest. Most of the people that we've had in right now are people that we know. They've done well. We've had a published author, a business owner, but we've never had somebody of your caliber, somebody who's had work cited by the Supreme Court, who's got a couple of books out. You've got Moral Combat, Why the War on Video Games is Wrong, and then How Madness Shaped History, which we're probably going to try and tag in on a little bit of those here in a little bit because I know a lot of people think that video games incite violence, which is not true. But I could see somebody making the same argument about D&D. But you're also an avid D&D player as well, from what I've read on some of your bios.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been playing since first edition, which gives you a sense of how old I am.
I wasn't going to say that.
Early 80s.
Oh, man. So usually we ask people when they're more of our friends, like not somebody as well known as you, because we want to make sure your name is getting out there, that when people listen to this podcast, they go, oh, that's Chris Ferguson, not, the Pirate Captain or something. We usually ask them, what their favorite character, race, class is. And I want to give you that same opportunity. What is your favorite character that you've ever played in your extensive time of playing? Who was it? What did they do?
Oh, good. That's a really, really good question. Yeah, sure. So probably my favorite character that I ever played goes all the way back to first edition, although I resurrected her in fifth edition with a new group that I've been playing with for about a decade and a half. But way back in first edition, they came out with, in Dragon Magazine, I still remember it was issue number 114, and they came out with this witch class. I think it was supposed to be an NPC class, but everybody played it anyway. And it was awesome. And so I played this witch character, which was, I think now it's more common for, you see more men playing as female characters, but back then it was kind of weird, or it was perceived as weird, I think, a little bit. But I was really big into Stevie Nicks at the time, and so I think that probably had some influence on this character. But really enjoyed playing her. It was a really cool class. They have updates to it on DM's Guild now, so even though it's not official, you can still find 5th edition witch classes, and managed to play her again. Had a lot of fun. She survived both times, so there must be some luck there. So it was a real cool experience.
Well, you've got a better survival ratio than I do. I played a campaign where I was dying every episode. Every episode I was dying. So, are you an active member on the DM's Guild? Do you actively promote or produce any content on the DM's Guild?
Yeah, I've got a couple things on there. Nothing that's I can't claim to be a bestseller. I'm not about to open the next, Piazza or anything of that. So Paizo, whatever, however.
Who knows?
But yeah, I got a couple things on there that I think every year I make a couple $100 from selling stuff, which I guess isn't too bad.
That's not bad at all.
Yeah.
Considering
So
the most I've made,
it's a lot of work
$1.
to get a couple $100, but yeah, it's cool.
Well, we appreciate getting into that a little bit. It definitely lets people see who you are, that you're more than just a professor writing about the topic, that you're an active member of playing in this game, which is going to help people understand the main topic for today. And the title of this episode, Are Orcs Racist? Now, my personal belief, no, I don't think orcs are racist. There's no one you can... I think that they were a creature they've changed over time. We've seen in previous cultures, and we talked yet again about this during lunch, where they used to be more pig-like looking. And now they've changed and updated. And you've mentioned this, I think, in your article a couple spots. There was other areas that I was focused on. So go ahead and break down your article. Give the title that you want to call it, because I've got Are Orcs Racist? Dungeons and Dragons, Ethnocentrism, Anxiety, and the depiction of evil monsters. I got a Florida education, so it's hard for me to talk.
Yeah, well, this kind of came up, for maybe about 2 or 3 years ago, and probably some of this predates, my being aware of it. But I spotted some of these typical Twitter wars going on about Dungeons and Dragons, where there were these really passionate debates about whether the portrayal of evil monster races, and everybody talked about the orcs and sometimes drow as well, but whether these monster races, because they were portrayed as inherently evil one way or another, was that racist? And kind of the two arguments I kind of distilled from that conversation was one, that either people who are playing Dungeons and Dragons and kind of experience this sort of racial essentialism, if you will, with drow and orcs, that they would then take that and apply it to real life, so that racism in D&D could kind of transfer to racism in real life. Or perhaps, even if that weren't the case, that there was this kind of a consensus among particular players of color that they were offended by these depictions of monsters, that it reminded some people, the orcs reminded people of different ethnic minorities in real life. And so these were, kind of moralistic arguments. They were passionate, and people get angry at each other on both sides, as people do on social media. But it raises these are empirical questions too, right? I mean, these are kind of like science can try to answer some of these questions, both in terms of whether there is any kind of at least correlational relationship between D&D playing and racism in real life. Or is it really true that there's this kind of like groundswell of activism among players of color, that this is really something a majority of players of color are concerned about? And so I thought to try to at least provide some answer for these questions. Of course, it's only one study, and I'd love to see more studies tackle these kinds of issues.
Right.
But the gist of it was there didn't seem to be any correlation between playing Dungeons and Dragons and racist attitudes in real life. And, and most people, whether they were players or not, or whether they were people of color, or whether they were white, did not appear to be offended by the sort of standard depiction of orcs And I think it was about 10% of people were offended by it, but the vast majority were not. So this, I mean, I kind of interpret this as good news. I mean, I guess it sort of depends on which side of the argument you're on, whether you take this as good news or not. But I mean, the really good news is that playing D&D doesn't seem to cause, or doesn't seem to be related to racism in real life. And the sort of arguments for changing D&D appear to be a minority argument. That doesn't mean we should dismiss them. But even most people of color don't seem to be terribly concerned about this issue of orcs or drow, being presented as racist.
No, looking at the data and the study size and stuff, and I'll let I'm going to let Loke ask a question here in a second, but it does correct. I think what it was like 10% overall. Out of how many people did you do the study over?
It was 300 and some. I forget the exact number, but it was over 300 people that were involved.
Right, and so 10% of those were actually came out. That's as in your study that we have right here, said that they believed orcs were racist. That's a minor. That's like what 30 people, if that. Yeah,
it was interesting. The number changed a little bit. So what we did is, we asked this question kind of subtly at first. We asked if they found the orc sort of description to be offensive, and you got about a 10% response rate in the affirmative for that. Later on, I then gave them these kind of like distractor things, sort of other things had nothing to do with the hypothesis, just kind of trying to keep people from hypothesis guessing. And then at the very end, I then asked them another set of more blunt questions, and at that point, I did ask them more bluntly, do you find these orcs to be, this description of orcs to be racist? And then the number actually jumped from about 10% to about 33, 34%. Still a minority, but an increase. And what I suspect happened there is that the wording of the question matters. So I think what happens is for some people, and by the way, it wasn't really people of color that, sort of jumped in percentage. It was more women than any other group that sort of increased in affirmative answers for racism. And I think what's happening is people assume, well, if you're asking me if this thing is racist, it must be. Otherwise, why would you have asked?
Right.
So I think there's that kind of weird impact that we're getting from some of this stuff. Because otherwise, those numbers don't really make a lot of sense. So, most people don't find something to be racist, but not offensive. Yeah.
And here's a question for you on the people who did find it racist. How much experience did they have in the past playing D&D? Were they lifelong players? Were they, hey, I just picked this game up yesterday? Yeah. Was that data brought in? Because that could be something. Because we're seeing with Stranger Things and all these other nerd shows, Critical Role, that D&D is taking off. People are finding that the nerd culture that used to be used and abused, you weren't cool if you were a nerd. Now everybody thinks it's cool. So are these people that were lifelong players? You said yourself, you got first edition. Loke's a first edition player. I mean, we've all played it at some point, but we all started. I, in fact, started with Pathfinder, a 3.5. Was that something that may have taken into effect, that they may have only seen orcs from this generation and maybe not their long history?
Right, that certainly is possible. In this study, the history with D&D playing was not a predictor of either sort of a sense of offensiveness or racism. With the racism question, it really was, again, women were more likely to endorse that than were men. And also more aggressive people were, what we call trait aggression, more aggressive people were more likely to endorse the racism question than other individuals, which is really interesting.
Can you explain?
in a way.
It does seem weird. Can you explain what trait aggression is for somebody who's like a casual listener to that?
Yeah, so trait aggression is basically it's a personality style where you just are more aggressive. That's just who you are, So you're more likely to perceive other people's ambiguous behaviors as personal attacks. You're more likely to want to respond retributively, to get back at them. If someone insults you, you're more likely to want to hit them or something of that sort. So you tend to escalate quickly in terms of using aggression to solve conflict.
90% of Twitter.
Yeah, the Biff Tannins from Back to the Future.
They're very much overrepresented on Twitter, yes.
Yeah. It's crazy. It's something that wasn't even thought of. Do you have a roundabout time that you remember hearing this discussion being started? Were orcs racist? Because it's something I've only heard of in just a couple of recent years.
Well, yeah, it's become very timely too with the changes that Wizard of the Coast is now announcing that they're going to be proceeding with.
They're taking things that have made these races unique and powerful in their own rights, and they're almost stripping it away because they don't want them to be perceived as bad. But I think that's as you as the storyteller. It goes on the DM. Like if you're out there and you're telling the story, and the bad guy may not be the orcs. If you look at Harmon Quest, Dan Harmon's show he did on VRV, he was a half-orc. It was a village of monsters that were good people, and it was actually the opposite. Some of the more betraying characters were humans. They were bad people.
Yeah, I think in terms of like the historical pattern of this, it mirrors, I think, a lot of other stuff that's happening in politics over the last maybe 6 to 8 years. And I'm trying to choose my words carefully here a little bit. I'm not really on either the left or the right for the most part. I'm probably an Obama progressive is really kind of how I describe myself. But I think there were a lot of changes. I mean, they're on both sides. I mean, both the right and the left became more extreme, I think, in various ways. And I think you have what a journalist, Matt Iglesias, called the Great Awakening, I guess, that started in about 2014. So you kind of see this increasingly anxious, focus on identity in big ways, across politics, across journalism, across academia, and also in role playing. So I think that these discussions, which really accelerated, like I said, in the last probably 3 or 4 years, but there are threads that go back earlier. I think kind of are mirroring these larger trends in society for people to take more and more extreme views of things, kind of like moral hygiene, kind of moral grandstanding kind of views of things, and then get really angry at people that don't agree with them. And again, it's not a left thing. Other people on the right side do this as well, of course.
Right.
But it's increasingly divorced from critical thinking and data and stuff like that. So it does worry me in a more general sense about where we're going with some of this stuff.
Now, I'll go ahead, Luke.
Have you seen any of the new leaked information for the new Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse book that is supposed to replace the Monster Manual and will be making vast changes to many of the races, including orcs, according to the leaked information we're seeing online at sites like Screen Rant? We're not on. We don't have the insider information, so we don't have a leaked copy for ourselves yet.
Yeah.
But
nobody leaks anything to me either, so I haven't seen that. The last I heard was I think somebody announced changes to the Drow in Wizards of the Coast, where I think they're going to try to sort of nuance Drow society quite a bit more than historically been true. I don't know if I've heard a lot about orcs necessarily, and of course, on the other hand, this Paizo sort of famously is the stories kind of go back and forth a little bit about exactly what they're doing, but the gist of it seems to be they're either partly or fully removing slavery as a topic from their main Pathfinder setting. So there've been a few changes in that direction. I haven't heard very specifically about what they're doing with this revised Monster Manual. Of course, Candlekeep Mysteries was another book that created some controversy because of the ostensible wheelchair accessible dungeon and the
we had a
relatively high
Senator
number of non-binary NPCs and so on and so forth.
But these are like, and I get in the more published manuals and stuff like that people want that, but it's you as a DM that gives that life. These are, and we've said this in the past on our podcast, that the guides, they're just that. They're guides. They're nothing in these things are written in stones. How many times have you been a DM and you said, okay, I want these guys to go forward, and they just take a hard left turn and go nowhere where you want them to go? So I trying to adjust the writings instead of just addressing the player bases, I think, is where we're missing the issue here on this.
Yeah, I think the trick is, of course, people on both sides of the argument will kind of point out, well, you can ignore the rules, and play your own game the way you want to. But, of course, that's an argument that cuts both directions, too. I mean, you could leave things the way they are and still change your game how you want it to be, too. And I think what's happening is same as some of the stuff we're seeing with, book bannings in schools and, the deplatforming of Joe Rogan or whatever, these other issues are. It's really people are trying to control messaging. And people have this sense, I think, that, if you read something, that your attitudes towards the world are going to radically change simply from being exposed to some sort of writing. And they really want to control messaging. So I think what we have here is, again, these two sides, the traditionalists and the progressives, are really kind of trying to control this kind of narrative through role playing. They kind of say, well, if you don't like the way we want to do it, you can play it how you want to. But then they kind of, I sort of watched like the resurgent TSR, which seemed to last not very long,
Right.
who were sort of ostensibly anti-woke, and how people kind of went right after that to destroy them on Twitter. So there's some insincerity, I think, to this idea of, well, you can just play the game how you want to, because they'll just go after whatever other alternative platform there is to play it that way. But I think it really comes down to, I mean, it's trying to control messaging, so it's not necessarily about making the game funner, but it's really about, people's moral universes. And unfortunately, if you end up with two groups that have very set views of what something should look like, it can be very difficult to compromise and figure out some way forward.
Yeah, it's something again.
Well, and you were saying earlier about they're removing things like slavery and things that may be seen as offensive. How do you make a bad guy bad if they're not allowed to do bad things?
Yeah. Well, what's also unclear is whether any of this is actually helpful. I feel people sometimes say, well, what's the harm, in sort of making these changes? And, it's, Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, wrote this book about, they call it The Coddling of the American Mind. But, I think that makes some fair points, that we're kind of bubble wrapping everything. And we have this sense of people, if they're exposed to something noxious, that they're so fragile, they'll break. And I'm not sure that is a healthy way of, addressing these sorts of issues. I mean, anxiety and depression are increasing in our society as we're doing these sorts of things. And that's correlational. I can't say that's definitively causal necessarily. But I'm not sure that these trends towards what they call safetyism, are necessarily, good, because, in Pathfinder, slavery was an evil thing. And, the idea was the PCs were supposed to fight it. And, there were rules in the book saying that a PC should not own slaves, so it was very clearly an evil sort of thing. And so I don't know that if we're like removing the topic from these games, we were supposed to talk about slavery 10 years ago. I mean, now we're sort of like removing it entirely because people are too, fragile to discuss the topic. I'm not sure that that's really healthy. I mean, I don't know that that's helping the audience in the way that even the makers of these products think it's going to be helpful.
Right. I mean, because if you think about it, even slave traders, let's go back and we're going to talk about a little bit of history with this. People selling slaves didn't feel that they were doing anything bad because their cultural norms, that was what it was. So are they lawful evil? Are they lawful good? This a lot, because they've removed alignments in a certain editions, I believe, not like any here in the 5e editions. But how do you feel about that? Because we're going to get into another topic you were kind of talking on, like anxiety and depression. That's actually something Bolg wanted to bring up, is using D&D to kind of help cope with some of this stuff. But if we're making it softer on these guys, are we really helping people? A great tool to help people overcome, what's the word I'm looking for? Shyness and issues like that. It's brought a lot of people out. But I just want to know how that, if we're not addressing slavery in this form, how are we going to be able to do it? Because just because you're a slave trader doesn't mean you're a bad person. That may be your Monday 9 to 5 job, and it's just a game. For those of you who are listening to the podcast, it's just a game. We're talking about it in the game. We're not saying that any four of us are out there dealing in slave trading right now. We're just using it as what our characters would do, which is how the game is supposed to be played.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and like you said, this is something you're trying to build the villain. The villain's got to. I mean, if you want the villain to be an Adolf Hitler or a Joseph Stalin, somebody who's a real big bad who's doing bad things. If you're not allowed to have them do bad things, how do you? Why would the good guys be fighting against them? Why are they trying to stop this evil empire that allows slavery from conquering their hometown? Why are they? Where is the motivation? To step up and do good things. If we got this good guy who's invading us, everybody likes him.
It's almost like we're given like parking tickets, and we're like, he's just a little bit parked over to the left. So I agree with I agree with your point that we are definitely like kind of like softening up and it's going to have a negative effect on this. And I also can definitely see Loke's point where how are we going to create villains if we're telling people that they can't play, they can't make these people bad?
Yeah, now had they called the D&D races species from the very beginning, so that they don't have that word connotated with them, do you think that would have? I mean, do you think we'd be having this debate today? If because these are not humans; these are made up mythical creatures. Most of them straight from mythology, history. But they're not you're not going to discriminate against an orc. Because you're probably never going to see an orc unless we find some other planet that happens to look like orcs and we call them orcs. But even then, they're not really the orcs from D&D. They're space orcs, a different, So creating a creature. How different does a creature need to be from humanity to be allowed to be evil? Like devils and demons, can they be evil? I mean, by their very nature, that by what they are, can they be evil?
That brings back up the satanic panic thing, because you pointed it out in your paper that they took them out of earlier editions, and then there was such a player outcry that they put them back in.
Yeah.
Is that going to happen again now? Are people going to go, well, where are our bad guys? We need bad guys.
Yeah.
And then put them back into the 6th edition or 7th, wherever they're going to go.
Yeah. Well, that'll be the trick. I mean, I'd be very curious to see that. I mean, I think what's happening now for Wizards of the Coast and Paizo, and of course a lot of other places as well, is that people are watching things happen on Twitter, and they're assuming that what's happening on Twitter is somehow reflective of in this case, the player base. That if you have 100 very loud, angry people, or 1,000 very loud, angry people on Twitter, that this is a controversy that needs to be addressed directly rather than ignored and allowed to die. And so I think a lot of the decisions that these companies are making right now seem to be damage control type decisions in order to avoid social media controversies. The problem with that is, of course, there are two really. One is that only a tiny fraction of people are actually on Twitter, or at least are active on Twitter and engaging in these kind of dog piles. So you really are catering to a relatively small portion of your audience. Now, you might hope, well, maybe the vast majority just don't care. They don't care one way or the other. They'll just keep playing no matter what we do. And there's probably some truth to that. The other issue I think that these companies are making the mistake is sort of a basic misunderstanding of psychology. Is what's happening is there's an outrage over thing A, and so the company kind of gives in, apologizes. The apology is inevitably rejected. There's a demand for more changes. They give in. Now that's thing B. So they give in to thing B. They apologize. The apology is rejected. You end up with this apology treadmill, because what happens if you basically reward a behavior, right? If people get into a dog pile, they're outraged about something, and you give them what they want, they don't become happy and go away. You get more of that behavior. So I think that's kind of like the basic mistake of what some of these companies are doing. A few companies outside of role-playing have figured this out, like Coinbase and Trader Joe's and a few other places, even Spotify to some extent, have figured out that you just kind of need to ignore and sort of blow off these controversies, and that's what makes them go away.
Right.
But giving in to them, I don't know what, if Wizards of the Coast is likely to give in to every single Twitter outrage over the next 5 to 10 years as they create, edition 5.5 or 6, whatever they're going to call it. I don't know what the game's going to look like.
Yeah, well,
and,
for this Screen Rant article I was talking about earlier, we'll share it on our Facebook page so that the listeners can take a look at it. But one of the things they're doing is the stat modifiers that every race gets out of the book. They are changing the rules to where it doesn't matter what race you pick. You get a +2 to 1 stat and a +1 to 1 stat that you choose, regardless of what race you are, as part of your character creation.
We're essentially,
and then.
I'm sorry.
Well, and then for the orcs, they're removing the traits of aggressiveness and menacing, and giving them an adrenaline rush, and then the relentless endurance like a half-orc gets in their place.
So essentially we're homogenizing characters. We're taking away what makes each race, and we see this in sports too. Let's take it that we have found that we look at certain sports, and there are people that there are certain races and cultures that just do better in certain sports. And now we're homogenizing our races here in D&D that you're no longer special because you're an orc or you're a minotaur, because they're changing the way that minotaurs work, and then that to me is crazy. These are things that these races and creatures were very well known for, and we're just basically putting a blanket over them, saying now everybody is the same, and it ruins these characters. Don't get me wrong; I'll be the first to admit I like the way Tasha's worked, because Tasha's brought out this whole, hey, here's how you can create your own race. Kind of gave you a blanket little statement that made it easier, like, because you can't obviously come up with everything. And I give Wizards of the Coast the credit of that. Like, obviously, they're not going to have a half demon, half lizard person, or anything like that, but they gave you a way to do it. Now we're just kind of putting a blanket over them and going, now everybody gets to be special.
Yeah, the incredible saying, when everybody's special, then nobody is.
Yeah,
you're unique, just like everybody else.
Yeah. So I love this topic. You've been an expert. Where you guys are listening to Professor Chris Ferguson. He's over at Stetson University. He's our special guest. This is the episode that we have been talking about for the last couple months. So we've been excited to have him. We're glad he's here. He's a psychology professor. He focuses on video games. He's got a couple area of expertise from video, media effects, violence, aggression, sexy media, video games, virtual reality, and the thin ideal media. And we wanted to get his hot takes. He had just wrote this article, which is what we've been talking about for the first half of this podcast, which are Orcs Racist. And he did a great study on that. But I also want to kind of get into a little bit of psychology of the game, because we were going to talk about this topic a couple months ago. And then when Loke brought up that, hey, you were interested in being on our show, we were like, oh, well, we need to save this topic for you being the psychology expert. And we're talking about the psychological effects of the game, like the benefits and the negatives, if there are any. What have you seen? What have you noticed? What brings it out? We talked about it just a bit earlier, that, those people who are shy usually tend to start becoming more outward going. Can this game even be used? There's just a couple broad topics. You can pick your favorite and go from there. But can this game be used to help deal with past trauma?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah. See, there, unfortunately isn't tons and tons of research on Dungeons and Dragons, and probably the reason why is pretty clear. I mean, it just takes tons and tons of time. But there have been a few studies, going back decades in some cases, and most of that has been involved with using Dungeons and Dragons in therapy. So it does appear that D&D is one platform that can be very helpful for people. And again, it's kind of the populations you're talking about, shyer people, maybe people on the autism spectrum and such, to get engaged in a therapeutic setting, kind of use that as a way of projecting some of their real life issues, get some needs met through the game that they're not getting met in real life. And so there's actually a fairly consistent body of evidence that suggests that, contrary to what was thought in the 80s, that actually the D&D playing can be very useful as a therapeutic milieu, if you will, to kind of like address other issues that a person may be having, including trauma. And I think the other thing too is just like video games, one thing that's happened over the last few years is, of course, that 5th edition has really just taken off. I mean, it soared in popularity, and I think, like video games, it really, I hate to talk about anybody benefiting from COVID-19, but I mean, I think D&D did kind of benefit from COVID-19 in the sense that you can play it online, of course, and it is a really good way to, socialize with people, whether it's in real life on tabletop, or if you're doing it through some sort of online forum. And so I think people could get together and game online a lot during the pandemic when they were social distancing and stuff. So I definitely think there are some clear advantages to being able to play. I could certainly say, from my own personal experience, I find D&D playing to be an incredible stress reducing hobby. So I play probably a couple times a week. Wow. And I always look forward to it, and it always kind of takes me away. Not that I can't say I'm a coal miner or anything. I'm not living a terribly stressful life as an academic, but but for what stresses we do experience, it is kind of nice to have this this outlet a little bit. But like everything else, sometimes you get, back and forth. I mean, I will say on the other hand, I mean, the one disappointment from my study there is I did look at anxiety as one outcome. So the good news was that playing D&D was not associated with racists, and that's fantastic. Probably not a surprise to most players, but nonetheless, it's good to have the data. But on the other hand, it wasn't associated with anxiety either. So I was kind of expecting / hoping to see that there would have been a association with reduced anxiety, but I didn't see it, necessarily. And it may just be that, the gains in terms of reducing anxiety may be fairly short term, that you feel better that night, but it doesn't really fix all your problems necessarily.
Right.
And in that sense, it might be more similar to television. It's just a distraction in the short term.
Go ahead.
I think it also is dependent on the type of gameplay, because we've had situations where people are getting frustrated because nothing's getting done, or there's a certain problem that we're not able to fix. And it's similar with video games. I mean, I played Dark Souls and Rocket League. Those are not stress-reducing games at all. They are very stressful, but it's the enjoyment of that type of stress in the long term might help with the anxiety-reducing levels. And it was actually something in your paper that I was interested to see whether there was any kind of causation or correlation that could be found. And just like you, I'm surprised nothing showed up.
Yeah. Well, I think you kind of hit on the head. I mean, it sort of depends on the kind of game people are playing. Like, actually, I'm running a game right now that's pretty intense. I'd say it's an R-rated game. Not to be gratuitous about it, but I think the content's is pretty intense. It's not for kids. And there's a lot of stressful moments. I try to give the players a lot of real hard choices to make. And some of those choices may be, they're lose-lose choices, so they may not be exactly stress-reducing, types of choices. I think they're great narratively. At least I like to think they're great narratively. It's my game. But hopefully the players feel the same way. But maybe it's not exactly stress-reducing. Maybe it's more sort of like watching, a horror movie. You don't come out of it. You have fun, but it's not exactly stress-reducing, perhaps. But I think it really does depend on the different types of game, So, I mean, I play in another game that's actually pretty mellow. It's pretty, I don't think any of the PCs are terribly likely to die, So I think the stress isn't really there necessarily. And that might be a bit more relaxing and anxiety reducing than a more intense game where you never know what's going to happen.
Now, as a DM or a player, do you think it's beneficial to put players in those stressful situations like that to make them feel like they've got that there's something going on?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a individual choice sort of situation. So with the players I got now, they're mostly people I played with for like I said, a decade and a half. Maybe more at this point. I just gave them a warning. This is the type of game this is going to be. And I think that's fair to do. Kind of say this one might be a bit more intense than some other games. Your character may not come out looking as healthy as they did going into the game, assuming they survive it. And some of the choices are just going to be icky. That you really are. It's like what is it? I forget the name of it. The moral dilemma where the train is going down the tracks.
Oh yeah, the trolley experience.
The trolley thing. Yeah, it's like that kind of thing. I mean, either outcome is bad. It's just you have to pick which one is least bad.
Yeah,
or try to guess which one is least bad.
Big trolley experiment DM myself. I like to torture my players a little bit with
Can confirm.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's if you're going for again, I think narratively that stuff can work, but it may be a bit more stressful, to experience in the time. But other people don't want that. Other people just do really want the, we're just going to kind of take it easy, kill some bad guys. We'll always be on the side of right, and we'll know that unless we do something terribly stupid, that everything will kind of turn out all right. And that's fine too. That's a perfectly legitimate type of game. So, I think it's whatever the player needs or wants in that particular moment. And, I'm all for giving people a little bit of a heads up about what's coming. I think, some of the stuff like the contracts, I think that have been going around recently are maybe going a little too far. It turns out trigger warnings tend to backfire. That's another little tidbit of information. So I'm a little bit wary about going too far into trigger warnings and stuff like that. But other than that, as long as the players are matched to the game in terms of what they want, what they're hoping to get from it, I think it's all a lot of fun, even if it isn't necessarily stress reducing.
It's a thing that we keep repeating here on the podcast is 0 sessions are important to get that information across. Because if you're at the wrong table in the wrong game, you're not going to have a good time. You're just not going to.
I definitely agree.
Professor, so we're talking. It's great because you're a psychology professor, and there's a lot of psychology that goes on with this game. You know, we have events that break characters mentally, break the players mentally. The famous one in this podcast case is the time I had a paladin. He was a lawful good. He was a redemption paladin. He had done something so bad he was trying to redeem himself. So he was being non-violent, cast sanctuary on himself, walked all the way up a tower, looked like a Leroy Jenkins from World of Warcraft, all the way up the tower, did not, no damage, no nothing, got ready to walk down, knocked one dude, fell down the stairs, broke his neck, and it led into this whole adage. I was heartbroken. This character didn't want to hurt anybody. How do you feel about those kind of moments? Can you explain kind of maybe if there's a, oh man, I don't know where I want to go with this question because it's such a
deep personal connection to the character that you feel their pain when they.
Yeah.
Do you have?
Well, it's so I had a similar experience. You know, actually in 4th edition, I played for a long time a female sorceress who I actually named after my wife, just to add to the personal connection. But I played her for years, and then at some point she actually made the choice essentially to sacrifice herself for sort of like the greater good, if you will, for save creation or something of that sort. And it was a player decision. I mean, I didn't have to do it, but it seemed like the sort of thing she would do in that particular moment. So she died, and I had nightmares. I'm sort of embarrassed.
Oh man,
to say it. Not necessarily like wake up sweating nightmares, but I dreamed about it, for at least, days afterwards. I was sort of embarrassed a little bit about that. But you develop these kind of, we call them parasocial relationships, with these characters. I mean, again, people come to the game and do different things. Some people don't necessarily want to form these strong connections with their characters, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And other people do, they become like, either extensions of ourselves, or we pull from friends or family members to sort of influence how we develop. Or they're totally different, and they, are some sort of icon of what we think goodness looks like, or whatever else. But we do. There is a potential for many players, not all players, but to form these kinds of parasocial relationships with these characters, and it can be upsetting when they die. Just like hopefully not quite like a real loved one died necessarily, but in terms of feeling a little bit of grief after that happens, it's actually fairly normal. But of course, it's also what makes the game meaningful. Just like I've heard people make the argument, at least, that death is part of what makes life meaningful, in a way that it makes it valuable. And so I think, death in Dungeons and Dragons is part of what makes, our connections with our characters more poignant.
You've given me a new term for how I DM, because I'm a facilitator of parasocial relationships.
That almost sounds like
the whole goal every time I DM is I want my players to form that connection with their this made up character, so that I can make them feel something, whether it's good, bad, indifferent. But if we've succeeded, I mean, that's the storyteller who has never written anything in me, I guess. I want them to experience that and feel that connection, and it's kind of like why people watch dramas and comedies, and because the goal is to get them to feel something as a result of the movie. That's what I think the goal as a DM should be for the players, is to get them to feel that emotional connection. And sometimes they're not good, sometimes bad stuff. I know there's plenty of those tearjerker movies out there that they have big audiences that love those movies where you go in and they come out crying. It's like, why are you going to a movie to make you cry? I'll go watch a superhero movie and get or a comedy and laugh. But
I love you, 3000.
Yeah.
Oh, I know. I have a question for you too on that. Is it healthy to have these kind of relationships with these characters?
Yeah, it's nothing inherently wrong with it. I mean, yeah, like anything else, they could maybe go a little too far for some people if it becomes obsessive or if it's causing more anxiety than it is good. People do it though for a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's just fun. Sometimes it really is. These parasocial relationships are kind of sitting in place of real ones that are missing in a person's life, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. At least it's a fairly positive defense mechanism, if you will, although the problem is more that they don't have the real life relationships, not that they're creating a parasocial relationship. So it's not necessarily inherently bad, like I said, unless it's becoming quasi-delusional or something, like they think the person really lives or something of that sense. I think where people get tripped up with them a little bit, this is where I think I've seen this happen with comic books a lot more recently. I don't really follow comic books. I've never been into them terribly, so I've no dog in these fights, but every so often you'll see a comic book will take a pre-existing character and change them in a significant way, typically by changing some aspect of their identity. So a lot of it, of course, is becoming more progressive. So they may take I think the one I recently heard, and I didn't follow that closely, so I hope I'm not mangling it, but I think there's some version of Superman that now they made him bisexual.
Yeah, it's his
Superboy.
Yeah, it's his son. It's Jor-El's not the name of his son, but it's his son. That's they did it. A lot of it's come out now that they kind of did that because they knew it was going to draw a lot of media attention. And now that the comic's not selling any well, it's everybody else's fault. That's
Well, that's what happens with these. Is people then say, "Well, all these fans are hating it because they're they're bigoted."
Yeah,
or whatever.
Insert general insult here.
Yeah, but oftentimes what happens is you just they have this relationship with this character and you just changed it on them, and that's what's oftentimes provoking the anxiety. I mean, I'm not going to say there's no bigotry in the fandom. There is, but oftentimes the interpretation of what's happening is the least generous possible interpretation when there may be some complexities in there.
Yeah, one of the more recent ones I'm privy to was when they scripted the flip and made Captain America a Hydra agent. That pissed off a lot of people. And it's so bad that they had to retcon it, I think, 3 issues later.
Yeah, it was something ridiculous. But changing these characters. Now, what happens if, let's say a character experiences this change in the game, but the player, I'm trying. The question's there, but it's not coming out in my head. But it's something to do with how the player adjusts to these changes, good or bad. Let's say a player has a bad reaction to a great change, to a change in there. Let's say we'll use the example of falling down the guy falling down the stairs.
Yeah.
Is there something that people should be worried about with these kind of changes?
Yeah, I mean, as DM, I've always been reluctant myself to make. On one hand, death is death. He didn't really necessarily change the character with a death. There's a normal grieving process that may happen there, and that may suck for the player. But I tend to worry about that less than when you do something that fundamentally changes the character's nature, like changing their alignment, or the good old fashioned first edition. What was it? There was some sort of belt of gender reassignment or something like that. I forget the name of it. Yeah, that one there.
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong, with if people want to do, have a trans character, non-binary, that's totally cool, But if you take, a character's identity and you change it significantly, that really can change that player's relationship with that character. So even something like alignment, you have a good character, change them to an evil character. I mean, that if you work that out with the player in advance and that's part of a narrative arc that you're planning, that could be kind of cool. But if you just sort of surprising the player with that change to the character, or oftentimes, particularly in the old Gary Gygax modules, it just sort of happened. You touched the wrong thing, and voila, you're either a pool of green slime or you're evil or something.
Yeah, it's the corruption of the One Ring legacy.
Yeah,
where you get the magic. I've had it happen to characters of my Broken, who was actually in the same campaign Bolg comes from. Had a cursed sword that if he every time he critted with it, his alignment would go one shade darker, one shade more evil.
And in that campaign, you were a crit machine, so it was.
Yeah, and it got to the point where he's sacrificing children to get warlock powers because he was. Yeah. You know, he went from being the hero of the campaign to being a villain for a little while, and then you had to go through a whole redemption arc to get him back to being a good guy again. You know, I could see where if somebody who's not, I personally enjoyed having to go through the redemption arc, and you know, I mean, I in some of our downtime, I made sure he lost all his money and became a
brothel a redemption.
yes, owning a brothel is a redemption arc.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so he, I worked with the DM and made sure he lost all his money on the downtime and went through this whole soul searching thing to start bringing him back to the, away from the darkness. And of course, they separated and destroyed the evil sword so that it would stop influencing.
Right.
But it's one of those things. If the character's not prepared for that kind of, a change, I could see where that. I've done it to players in my own campaigns where, like, we use the staircase example, where the paladin has suddenly lost his oath of passivity. And loses his paladin abilities because, he murdered somebody by knocking him down the stairs.
The stairs murdered him. I didn't murder him.
Yeah, that's what happened in the camp. I'm using it as an example now. So if he loses his paladin powers because of that action, where the DM, well, you didn't have to have him fall down the stairs. I mean, does the player want to keep playing that character when he's not a paladin anymore? I mean... So it's one of those things where I can see, especially people who are attached to their characters, where it could be difficult to deal with change.
I want to talk about you got something, Bulk? I'm sorry.
Just the whole Orcs Racist. The whole premise behind this was always interesting to me because, well, Bolg is an orc. From the outset, he was chaotic neutral. Actually, he was chaotic stupid, but that's completely. He had a 6 intelligence. Morality was not on his radar at all.
He went to Florida. He went to Florida public schools.
He went by his whims. He was technically a cannibal. He didn't eat orc, but he ate other races. If the meat was there, he ate it. And he became a chef because, well, he found a chef hat and he didn't have anything to do in his downtime. Bam, there you go. Now you have. Chunks of elf meat in a trencher of rye, But I never played him in a culturally insensitive way or a racist way. It was always just he follows his whim in the way that in the old editions, Grumsh was the big orc god, the way that Grumsh would want him to do, which was go into battle, be strong, not necessarily want to do evil things, but just do the orc way, which the description that's in the monster manual that you actually have here in the paper always seemed more to me the way the English would describe Vikings. And not racist in any sort of way, just like, oh, these barbaric people, this is how they are.
Yeah.
So that was my big dog in the fight, but then...
So we talked about races. Are they racist inherently? I think you guys have made some really good arguments. But what about classes? Something that we don't honestly think a whole lot about sometimes. Are certain classes inherently evil? And maybe what's the psychology behind that? Because think about it, warlocks. When you're doing warlock stuff, my favorite warlocks to pick on are the World of Warcraft warlocks because they're dealing with fell magic, which has a long history in the World of Warcraft of being just generally bad. Are there classes that are inherently evil, or is that something maybe we're looking too deep into? What do you think about that, Professor?
Yeah, I think the key one probably historically has been the assassin, class or subclass, which it's sort of hard to roll that into a lawful good kind of alignment. I guess you kind of think, well, maybe like the James Bond, sort of archetype that would sort of make sense if you kind of think of it as of the mechanics of the class as opposed to the flavor of the class. You could sort of make it fit, somewhere.
If you have a license to kill, it's legal.
Yeah, you get a license, so it's okay. I guess probably even Bond would be more of a lawful neutral than a lawful good necessarily. But I think that same thing with the Warlock. But I think what you see is then players like the mechanics of the classes, Warlock being a classic example of this, and so they want good variants of it. So even though the initial gist of the Warlock class back in, I think, 3rd edition when it first started coming up, was the sense of you're making this kind of like dark pact with some, questionable authority. They didn't have, I don't think they had to be evil, but they always were kind of like, obscure and eldritch and, so neutral evil, were maybe neutrals as far as you would get. But yeah, then you get people who want to play them, as good. And I don't necessarily mind that flexibility. Like I said, maybe with some classes like the assassin, it's a little bit of a stretch to think of a lawful good assassin.
But I kill all the bad people. It's yeah.
Well, and then you get
like
all the religious classes could be problematic, especially if you're playing in a very certain religious groups that would take the fact that you are playing a priest of a non-Judeo-Christian god. So there are people out there that would be offended by that at their tables. Their paladins are all Templars and their clerics are all following the monotheistic Christian thing. So that I mean, part of that comes with knowing your table too. But I mean, some people would have issues with that as well. I mean, and that may be where some of the whole satanic panic stuff from the 80s. But I mean, it's a game. It's not real.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest points of contention. This is a game. I had a older lady at my job. I'm a pharmacy tech, who saw I had a lapel pen of it's a D&D lapel pen, a D20. It says Adventure Awaits. She's like, "You're playing that satanic game. You're a Satanist." I'm like, "No, ma'am. I play it to enjoy my time, and it's a game usually about good overcoming evil." And so what about that is satanic? And she had no response. And yeah, it's just any class has the potential to be good, any class has the potential to be evil. The one that's the hardest for me to justify is necromancy, but even then you could theoretically come up with a reason why they're doing it for good reasons.
I'm bringing my loved ones back to life. I don't want to be alone.
Haley Joe Osment from The Sixth Sense is technically a necromancer.
Yeah, I think you could make the argument like a Van Helsing character. Yeah, it was mastering the dark arts in order to destroy undead as opposed to summon them and control them.
Somebody who's putting spirits to rest and fulfilling their last tasks would technically be a necromancer.
Yeah.
I mean, even in my world, I have the College of Spirits Bard, which that's entirely their thing, is they put them to rest before necromancers can get their hands on them for nefarious purposes.
Yeah. Oh. Professor, what? Because we're coming towards the end of this, and I really want people to get to know you. We're talking with Professor Chris Ferguson. We're going to be plugging him quite a bit for the rest of this episode for sure. He is a professor at Stetson University. He's here in DeLand, Florida. It's a great one. You can find him on Twitter. I don't think I actually threw that out at the beginning. It's CJ Ferguson 1111 on Twitter. Tweet him out. He's a really good dude. He has a couple books out there: Moral Combat, Why the War on Video Games is Wrong, and How Madness Shaped History. He's been an awesome guest. He's been talking to us about the psychology of the game. It's the biggest, one of the biggest topics affecting the D&D game right now is, are orcs racist? And I want to make sure you have any final arguments that you have to let people know what you truly believe on this topic. Professor, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, I mean, I think, again, what I'm seeing in these social media spaces like Twitter, which is really and now that you told me people to follow me, is really a dark pit of despair, but it is what it is. But I mean, I see a lot of people. I actually watch two people on either side of this debate, a traditionalist and a progressive, both talk about gatekeeping. And so the idea, we're the gatekeepers now. You can't play in the game anymore. And both, again, I know people hate both sides of ism, but as I say sometimes, both sides hate both sides of ism. But really, both sides were engaging in the sort of same behavior. What I really like to see, I mean, in terms of if anybody from Wizards of the Coast or Paizo is listening to this, I mean, I think that the healthy message forward, healthy plan to go forward with this is not that one side wins or not that the other side wins, not that we leave things exactly the same or that we, make Dungeons and Dragons into something like adventuring through a college university dorm, but rather that, we find some ways to get people from both sides to get together and compromise, on some of these things. Like, you mentioned earlier, maybe getting rid of the word race and using species instead, or I don't know. There may be some reasonable compromises that everybody can agree on. That maybe people get 60 to 70% of what they want, but they don't get everything what they want. But everybody kind of feels like they've been listened to. I mean, I think that's the road forward for these role-playing games. I think the risk now is that either Wizards or Paizo or any of these other companies are going to shift too far to one side or the other, and they're going to lose audience as a consequence of that. So, I mean, my hope is that, some people are going to like my study, some people aren't going to like it, but my hope is that, by bringing some data to this, it might be easier, in some ways suggesting maybe the stakes aren't quite as high as people had feared, that it may make that easier for people to sit down, work together, and figure out how the next edition of the game can be fun for everybody to play, whether they're a traditionalist or a progressive, rather than thinking like somebody has to lose and somebody has to win. At least that's my hope. We'll see what comes of this.
Go ahead, Bog.
So one of the questions I have for you is actually in your paper, you gave your thoughts on the data, and then you said this observation, of course, applies only to the specific context examined here, and more research is needed across other play modalities, particularly using pre-register studies. If you could do a pre-register study on any video game, what would you want to do for this type of thing? In big letters underneath it, I wrote the Elder Scrolls, because race in the Elder Scrolls is insane.
Huge.
It is insane. It's just, I'm just presenting the data as it is. There is a race of just black people.
Yeah.
Called the Red Guard. And in the lore, they're part of a greater subset of humans. But in the play modality, you get to choose being a black person, which to me is insane. But also, I mean, if they have differing abilities and stats, then that may make sense.
Right, yeah. Well, one of the things we're doing right now with race in video games in our lab is we're actually having people come in and play the old Resident Evil games.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you may remember, Resident Evil 5 got some criticism for its depictions of race in the game. There's a lot of back and forth about whether it was racist or not. But, what we're kind of trying to do is very bluntly see, if you play Resident Evil and the zombies you're shooting are black as opposed to the zombies you're shooting are white, does that carry over into any aggression in real life? Now, we can't have people knife each other in the lab or anything like that. As much fun as that would be. But, the aggression is very mild. It's sort of like putting someone's hand in a bucket of ice water or something like that. So it's not gang violence or anything. But, so we're kind of testing some of that sort of like race in video games, that way. I think, it'd be pretty interesting to look at a game like Elder Scrolls, which again would require a much longer investment. It's harder to play Elder Scrolls in 30 minutes than Resident Evil, but I think it would be interesting to look at, some of these, these types of issues and how people respond to sort of, like you said, like, if you are playing a character, this is the black race and this is the white race, and is that kind of weird for people,
Oh man, that soundbite's not going to go over well for you. Hey, Professor, I want to be the first to thank you here for being on our podcast. Like I said, you're probably the biggest guest we've had so far, and we really look forward to having you again. Anytime you have any D&D papers or anything like that, we welcome you. This will always be an open platform for you here. Anything else we can ever do for you, just let us know. But with that being said, this will probably be closing to the end of our show.
Awesome. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate you guys having me on today. It's been great.
No, we appreciate having you. Thanks, Professor.
Cool. Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Oh, alrighty, guys. With that being said, the music's playing. And you know what that means. We had Professor Chris Ferguson here on Chef Bolg and the Pirate Captain's Recipes for Everything. Make sure you guys go find him on Twitter. Read his stuff. It is amazing. It works. It's generally entertaining. I liked it. You guys liked it?
Yep.
All right, cool. With that being said, say goodbye, Bolg.
Goodbye, Bolg.
And bye, Luke.
See ya.
We appreciate you listening to Chef Bolg and the Pirate Captain's Recipes for Everything, featuring Loke the Bard, of course. Make sure you go find us on Facebook to see what old concoctions Bolg is cooking up in the kitchen. And if you want your emails read, then email us at bolgandpc@gmail.com. And as always, happy adventures. Yarr!